Now we have Dr. Nathan Waltham up from Townsville.
Just do a screen check.
Yeah.
Valerie,
okay.
can you hear me? And you can...
We can all hear you. We can see you. Yeah, just put it on presenter view. Yep, you're good to go.
Good to go? Okay. Thanks, Valerie and Kath, for inviting me along to talk in this session. I'm really disappointed that I couldn't actually make it there in person, but in Townsville this week. But yeah, certainly with the advantages of technology, can zoom in and present some of our information from our work here. I'd like to firstly start to thank and acknowledge our traditional owners where I currently am. This is the Bindal people and the Walgarugabar people, but there are so many other Indigenous groups right along the GBR coast that we've been working with. Certainly pay my respects to their elders past, present and future emerging leaders. I'd also like to thank a big group of people, end users. These are a bunch of friends now that we've been working with for a number of years. Their logos are on the screen there. It's fair to say that we are in the Great Barrier Reef looking at a very interesting and dynamic ecosystem. If you're thinking about our catchments and our wetlands on the coast and then out to the reef, it's very much a diverse ecosystem, and it's going to take a huge ecosystem of people, partners, friends to turn back the clock on the damage and impacts we've been having on the Great Barrier Reef. So these are some photos from a whole range of different field sites we've been working. Lots of fun we've been having. I don't know how many cups of tea I've had with so many people there, but yeah, it's been such a rewarding process and is only increasing, which is really quite exciting to think coming into the future here. So we're here talking about coastal wetlands and restoration, and these are the kinds of images we have in our mind. Our politicians, our managers, this is the kind of image that they have, which is great. And it's certainly a big challenge for us in the Great Barrier Reef catchments because we have this competing interest of development and land use change along our floodplains, yet we still expect to have these wonderful ecosystems, these wetlands and a functioning reef along the coast. So we have a very competing challenge there. We have heard, I'm sure, during the conference, some of the exciting UN declarations that have come out. The one I'm most focused on is the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, and that was announced last year, and I think it's only a few weeks away from really hitting the ground and operating. A few of us got together and digested that, working in this coastal wetland restoration space, and we published a paper earlier, well, about 12 months ago now, actually. And we looked at, well, what does that actually mean, this decade on ecosystem restoration? And so that basically means that we're going now from a degraded, impacted system or seascape. In 10 years' time, we should have very much a functioning and effective and healthy ecosystem along our coastal areas. Let's think about the Great Barrier Reef in this case. That really opens up lots of questions. And in 10 years, to go from where we are now to a functioning ecosystem, I think's a little optimistic. However, you know, it's wonderful to see that, and we're embracing that, and we've got a lot of work to do in the next 10 years. There's lots of variability around that, lots of knowns and lots of unknowns as well. So this pathway is going to be very challenging. As I say, there's a network of an ecosystem of people working in this space, very hard right now in the Great Barrier Reef to try and implement that. In Queensland, we are very fortunate to have a framework for our coastal wetland restorations. We have our Queensland government, the wetlands team are very proactive in moving forward a lot of the knowledge, sharing the information, the lessons learned. And we've really come up with this wonderful model, this framework for implementing coastal wetland restoration projects. And we think about these projects in terms of the components and processes that these wetlands provide. Kath talked just then about ecosystem services, and then also as part of the framework, thinking about, well, what are the beneficiaries? What are the downstream use or the value of those particular wetlands, thinking about the components and processes. And there could be from fishing, environmental, could be cultural values, all those kinds of things. However, we are dealing with very much a modified system, and I think this is probably true, thinking about your local area where you're from, we've got modified, we've had these land use changes, and that changes the engines, the components, the moving parts within our ecosystems. And we need to be understanding that and considering that if we're going to be quite successful, if we think about the decade on ecosystem restoration. So we have very much to reduce ecosystem services, and the beneficiaries are being affected. And so this is the challenge that we face. If you think about the seascape, and in some cases for managers and politicians, that might be a little hard to think about because they're so diverse and so connected in complex ways. An effective currency that I use is to tell the Mangrove Jack story. And the Mangrove Jack is a species found in many places around the world. It's a tropical snapper, it's also known as. This species, certainly in GBR catchments, is highly targeted by recreational and commercial fishermen. It's a fantastic fish to catch, wonderful eating, it has a great eating quality. It has a very interesting life cycle. It's diadromous, so it starts its life cycle on the nearshore reefs. As small fry and small juveniles, they move into our estuaries and moving into freshwater habitats. And that's because there's such a rich source of nutrients and food supply for these species. As they grow, age, mature, they move back offshore again to complete their life cycle. So if you think about the seascape and how that's been affected by land use change, the Mangrove Jack is a great case study, because if that connection it needs across floodplains is lost, then the Mangrove Jack cannot complete its life cycle. And many of our farmers in North Queensland, our sugarcane farmers in particular, they love fishing. They have large boats in their garage, boats I could only dream of one day getting. But when you present the Mangrove Jack story to them and the connected seascape and floodplains, they really get it. It's that currency and information that they really understand, which is a great tool to get the message across. So my work for the last sort of 5 or 6 years has focused on looking at restoration efforts by our partners within the GBR catchments. And I don't have time today to talk about them all. However, I'm going to talk about a couple that I can fit within this time. We've targeted particularly the types of restoration approaches that are underway within the GBR catchment. So looking at bund wall removal, and I'll talk a bit more about the Mangala project site in a minute. We have a lot of interest in building water treatment wetlands. So these are wetlands built to intercept nutrient-rich, sediment-rich, pesticide, herbicide-rich waters and process that before reaching estuaries and the reef. So there's some projects underway there. We have a lot of aquatic plant growth that is having huge impacts on our connectivity for floodplains, also huge impacts on water quality. The oxygen cycling, for example. So we looked at some project sites there. Feral pigs is another huge impact on our coastal wetlands. We have these animals in plague numbers moving into our wetlands. There's been a huge interest and investment in putting fences around wetlands. So we looked at a couple of sites there. This is another ponded pasture. This is an earth wall removal project site we looked at down near Mackay. And the last project site was looking at trying to reduce or remove the excess supply of tailwater from sugarcane areas on the Burdekin. We have this oversupply of water, fresh water moving down the catchments, which is having a huge impact on our palestrine wetlands, basically smothering and choking up these areas with freshwater weeds. That was another project site. I have got time to talk about all those projects. All the reports are done and I'm happy to share those. Shoot me an email if you're interested. I wanted to talk briefly about the Round Hill Reserve. This was a feral pig project where Parks and Wildlife, Burnett Mary Regional Group had installed a fence, a very expensive fence around a coastal wetland that is part of a fish habitat area. It's got directly important wetland significance, national park. They've spent that money but didn't have any long-term capacity or certainly funding to monitor and evaluate the success of that project. So we thought this is a great chance for us to step in and do some science to support and evaluate their project. It's fair to say the Parks and Wildlife were only interested, their value that they had on that wetland was only about vegetation and bird community. So we did some fancy work with drones and habitat classifications and found how the vegetation community and structure was changing with time after the fence. That was quite interesting. What was interesting for me even more so, and this is taking a line of evidence to understand whether this is a successful project or not, was looking at the fish community and water quality. What was really interesting there in this project is even though the fence was built to keep the pigs out, it was doing a good job. The vegetation was coming back and the bird life was coming back and all was looking really good. Land tenure, the adjacent farmer has access for his cattle to go through that fence and feed on the salt marsh in that wetland. And so what we found was the cattle were doing a huge amount of damage, even though the fence was put up to keep the pigs out. So there was a huge learning there for Parks and Wildlife to really start to think about how they're managing their estate, particularly with land use tenure that involves this particular activity, this use, resource use. We also looked at freshwater turtles, and this is an interesting story. You put a fence around a wetland to protect it from feral pigs. However, there are animals, native animals on the landscape that also need to move around and access particular freshwater resources. So this particular turtle, he is inside the wetland and wasn't able to get out and move around. So you have this really interesting situation where you've got competing values. Fence to keep the pigs out, to protect and rehabilitate the wetland, but at the same time, you've got this other value and use in this particular case, our turtle. So we have this interesting dilemma to face there. I let that turtle go. I did save him. So just in case you're wondering, he was rescued, and Donatello went off to the pizza shop, I'm sure, and had a pizza with his other fellow friends. The second side I've got a bit of time to talk about is Mangala, and this was a really interesting project. This is an earth wall removal project. It has a long and really quite depressing, really, Indigenous link to country there, going right back to the stolen generation, a wonderful and really depressing as well history there. The earth wall was built in the 1940s to remove or move the homestead to another location. And what that created upstream of that earth wall was this freshwater habitat that eventually, and to this day, is still used for ponded pasture. So this is cattle grazing, late dry season, accessing this resource. So it sort of turns out to be quite a good use of the landscape if cattle and cattle grazing is the use that you would like there. However, what's happened over time is we've got a lot of freshwater weeds building up in that area now, and water quality is terrible. We have a very reduced level of fish diversity and birds using that area. So CSIRO back about 7 or 8 years ago received some funding from NHT to run some computer modelling to look at this idea of breaching the wall where previously herbicides had been used to try and control some of the freshwater weeds, and allowing the salt to return to the area upstream of the earth wall. And so the salt would destroy the freshwater plants. You know, it's a better method than using pesticides. So some pretty interesting modelling was done. The wall was breached in 2012, and it was amazing to see very quickly how that wetland recovered. You can see in the time-lapse photos there, the wetland changed very quickly from a weed, freshwater weed, you know, very low value habitats. The salt got in there, did its job. We were catching barramundi in there, so it was a great, great story to tell. That was the first.
Then you've only got about 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute, thanks. That was the first 4 years of the work. In continuing the work that we did, it worked out that we went through then a period of very high rainfall periods, and so the salt wasn't able to get into that wetland as often. So that particular wetland oscillates between a very dry and a very wet system. So, and it needed 7 years, 8 years of data. So short-term monitoring and evaluation isn't going to be very successful there. Low-lying agricultural and sugarcane areas is certainly an area of opportunity for upscaling, and this is an example of low-lying cane areas. This is where the water wants to come back into the landscape, previously under cane. We've completed a project looking at mapping out some of these low-lying areas, and this is leading now to some exciting wetland restoration projects and activating reef credits. So this is water quality market mechanisms. And an interesting part of that work is, this idea of taking cane out of production doesn't always satisfy a lot of our stakeholders. We have mill operators, for example, that don't like this idea of taking cane out of production. However, we have done some economics showing that if you build a wetland using that material to raise the adjacent property, you can actually have both benefits received. So you can have a whole range of services provided by that wetland, as well as increasing production on that adjacent land. So there's evidence now coming through that you can have multiple outcomes as part of these works. So my last slide, some strong messages really coming through. This idea of having single restoration projects targeting weeds or fish passage or water quality, I think is great, but we really need to think about the whole of the system. We need to start stitching these programs together, because if we don't, we're going to have these isolated pockets of restoration projects which become very difficult to prove upscale success. Maintenance funding is absolutely critical. If you have a project and there's no long-term maintenance finance or funding as part of that, I really think the project shouldn't go ahead. I'm happy to talk more about that later on. Collaboration is really important. Our low-lying marginal cane land project is showing there's alternative options. If you have market mechanisms, carbon, which Kath talked about, water quality, biodiversity credits, you can start to incentivise and ignite some of these projects. And we've talked about that in a paper that's just about to come out, which looks at bundling these services together, not just thinking about blue carbon or water quality, biodiversity. Can we have a project that stacks up these services? So thanks, Valerie. I hope I haven't gone too far over time. I'm happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thank you, Nathan. Yep. I don't know if you can see everyone in the audience, but quite a few people listening intensely. So does anyone have any questions for Nathan? This is from Kamal.
Hi, great presentation, Nathan. I just want to know, how do you deal with the agrochemicals that come through the anthropogenic land use behind the wetland areas? What happens in terms of water quality? Because some of those chemicals are pretty nasty. They stay in the water for long.
Yeah, they are very nasty, and it comes down to the design. If you think about a wetland for water treatment, so this is an engineered structure in the landscape, designed, positioned to treat water to your desired outcome. We think of those as in terms of water quality, nutrients and sediment in particular, and we can design the hydrology to meet those kinds of reductions that we're looking for. Pesticides and herbicides are a bit more tricky. They are dissolved, I guess, and can move very quickly with flow. Sometimes they're attached to sediment particles, and so if we're treating sediment, we can also expect to get benefits in terms of reducing the amount of pesticide, herbicide getting through. It is an area of active work that we still need to look at. The big focus is on dissolving organic nutrients and sediments. That's the big thrust of the work that we've been doing for quite a while in designing wetlands. But I agree, definitely we shouldn't also forget about pesticides, herbicides, because we do know they accumulate in fish that we love to catch and eat, and are turning up in some of our fauna and water samples near shore and offshore as well. So yeah, it's a good question, and we are trying to work in that space as well.